The Pope who showed up unannounced. The room was silent. Not the silence of peace, the silence of witnesses who had just felt something crack open inside them. The Pope stood at the edge of a narrow bed, his white cassock slightly wrinkled from hours of walking through cold corridors. And he was weeping. Not quietly, not with the controlled dignity of ceremony. He wept the way a man weeps when he has finally seen something he can no longer pretend does not exist. What he said next, barely above a whisper, through tears, would be repeated in headlines across 20 countries before morning. Background. It was the first day of March 2026. Less than 10 months had passed since white smoke rose above the Sistine Chapel, announcing to a stunned world that the Catholic Church had chosen its first American Pope. Robert Francis Prevost, 69 years old, an Augustinian friar from Chicago who had spent the better part of his adult life in the dust and heat of northern Peru, learning, as he once put it, that the gospel smells like sweat before it smells like incense. He took the name Leo XIV. Since his election, he had reorganized 2 Vatican dicasteries, dismissed a Monsignor whose financial irregularities had been overlooked for a decade, and issued a directive that no Vatican office should spend more on interior renovations in a single year than it distributed in charitable aid. The old guard bristled, the press watched hungrily, and the faithful, particularly those at the edges of the church, had begun, cautiously, to believe again. But nothing prepared anyone for what happened on the morning of March 1st. The letter. 3 weeks earlier, a letter had arrived at the Vatican. Not an official memo. Not a formal complaint through canonical channels. A handwritten letter in cramped but careful Italian from an 84-year-old woman named Sister Josefina, a Franciscan nun who had served the church for over 60 years, the last 4 of them as a resident of a care home called Casa Sant'Angelo. She had addressed it directly to the Pope with no certainty it would ever reach him. She had not written to complain. She had written because she was afraid that if she did not, she would die without having told the truth to someone who might still be able to do something about it. Father Valdivia, the Pope's personal secretary, found the letter buried in a stack of pre-sorted correspondence. He read it at midnight. He placed it on the Pope's desk the next morning without a word of introduction. Leo read it over breakfast and did not speak for a long time afterward. Sister Josefina wrote about cold hallways, about meals served at 4 in the afternoon, lukewarm by the time they arrived, about staff stretched far beyond what any human being could manage with care, about fellow residents, priests who had given their entire lives to parish ministry, now sitting in rooms with broken heating, waiting for medication that sometimes arrived late and sometimes did not arrive at all. She wrote about a man she called Father Marco, an 88-year-old former missionary who sat each morning in the corridor dressed, rosary in his hands, ready for a Mass that was only celebrated twice a week, because there was no one to celebrate it more often. Holy Father, they are not asking for luxury. They are asking not to be forgotten, and I fear that we have been. Leo read the letter 3 times. On the 3rd reading, he made a single pencil mark in the margin, beside Sister Josefina's final sentence. He said nothing to the Secretary of State, nothing to the Dicastery for Clergy, nothing to the Communications Office. He asked Father Valdivia to arrange a car for 6 in the morning on March 1st, and to ensure that no visit was logged in the official schedule. The visit. Rome, in March, still carries winter in its stones. The streets near the Vatican were nearly empty at that hour. A pair of carabinieri recognized the papal vehicle and straightened instinctively as it passed. Casa Sant'Angelo appeared as they turned down the narrow road, a long, pale building with iron balconies and tall shuttered windows. The main gate was unattended. The intercom took nearly 2 minutes to respond. When it finally buzzed open, no one came out to receive them. They walked in unannounced. The entrance hall was clean but cold. Near the door stood a plaster statue of Our Lady, with a votive candle burned down to nothing and not replaced. A young nurse named Elena appeared from a side corridor. She stopped when she saw the white cassock and went pale. She was perhaps 25, and looked as though she had been working for a very long time already. "Holy Father, we weren't told." "I know," Leo said. "I'd like to walk. You don't need to call anyone." She walked with them anyway. She told them 14 months she had been here, one of 3 nurses covering the morning shift, for 63 residents. 3 nurses, 63 residents. The Pope did not comment. He listened and walked. Father Lorenzo. In one room, a priest was sleeping past 7 in the morning. On the table beside him sat an untouched dinner tray from the night before, still covered in plastic wrap. Leo stopped at the door. He looked at the tray. He looked at the priest. Elena began to explain that the night staff had been short 2 people because of illness, and that sometimes the dinner trays— "What is his name?" "Father Lorenzo. He is 91. He was a missionary. Congo, I think, for 30 years. Leo moved quietly into the room and placed his hand lightly on the old priest's arm. Father Lorenzo opened his eyes slowly. He looked up at the face above him with the mild confusion of the very old and very tired. Then his expression shifted, not into recognition of who this was, but into something simpler, the recognition of being seen. "Buongiorno, Padre," Leo said softly. "Buongiorno. Are you the doctor?" "No, I'm just visiting." Father Lorenzo nodded with the dignity of a man who had learned not to expect explanations. "Good. It is good to have visitors." Leo stayed a few minutes, spoke quietly, made sure the old priest had water within reach. Then he stepped back into the corridor. His face was composed, but his jaw was set in the particular way Father Valdivia had seen before. Not anger, but the resolve of a man who has stopped deliberating and begun deciding. Sister Josefina. They found her on the 2nd floor, seated at a table with 2 other elderly nuns, prayer books open but not necessarily being read. When she looked up and saw the man in white standing in the doorway, she stared for several seconds, as though determining whether this was real. Then she pressed her hand over her mouth and closed her eyes. Leo walked to her table and sat down across from her, not standing over her, at her level, in a plain wooden chair, as though he had nowhere else to be. "I received your letter," he said. "I was not sure it would arrive." It arrived. She looked at him for a long time. Then, "We are not ungrateful. I want you to understand that. These priests, these sisters, they gave their lives, everything, and they are grateful. They are not bitter." A pause. "But they are very cold and very alone." It was the word alone that landed differently than the others. 3 hours. Leo spent 3 hours in Casa Sant'Angelo that morning. He did not make speeches. He did not pose for photographs. He sat with residents, held their hands, listened to stories about Congo and Peru and Argentina and Korea, the missions where these people had spent their youth, the parishes where they had buried the dead and baptized the newborn. He listened to a 90-year-old Jesuit describe saying Mass for minors in Bolivia in the 1970s. And he thought, this man carried the church on his back for 50 years, and now he cannot get his dinner while it is still warm. Before he left, he thanked Elena, the cook, and the 2 other nurses. He shook each of their hands, looked them in the eye, and said with complete seriousness, "What you are doing here matters more than you know, more than you have been told." He said it as a fact, not as consolation. The calls by noon, 3 phone calls had been placed from the papal apartment. The first was to Cardinal Bortoni, prefect of the Dicastery for Clergy. The conversation lasted 11 minutes. Leo did not raise his voice. He told Bortoni that he had visited Casa Sant'Angelo that morning, that the heating had been broken since November, that there were 3 nurses for 63 residents, that a former missionary had slept beside an uneaten dinner tray. He expected a full audit within 30 days, emergency staffing immediately. heating repaired within the week. The cardinal began to explain that these matters were ordinarily processed through. Leo interrupted him. Not rudely, with the quiet precision of someone cutting through rope. I'm not asking how they are ordinarily processed. I'm telling you what will happen. A pause. Of course, Holy Father. The second call was to the Vatican's administrative office, requesting 5 years of budget figures for all church-run elderly care facilities in the Rome region, compared with what had been spent on dicasteries and offices in the same period. In writing, by Friday. He used the word written twice. The third call was to his communications team. A direct statement, recorded the following afternoon, not edited for tone. The statement, March 2nd. A small room adjacent to the library of the Apostolic Palace. No podium, no flags, no staging. Leo sat in a plain chair. A camera, an operator, Father Valdivia standing to one side. He spoke for 16 minutes. He began with Leviticus 19:32. Rise in the presence of the aged, show respect for the elderly, and revere your God. He said that verse was not a metaphor. It was a commandment. He said the church had built hospitals and schools and orphanages across 2,000 years, and that this was right and holy and good. And then, and this was where the stillness entered his voice, he said that somewhere in that long administrative history, the church had developed a subtle and dangerous habit, caring more for institutions than for the people inside them. We maintain the buildings, we file the reports, we approve the budgets, and we tell ourselves that caring for the structure means we are caring for the people. It does not. A warm chapel and a broken heater in the room next to it are not the same thing. A balanced ledger and an uneaten dinner tray are not the same thing. He paused. I visited a home yesterday morning. I'm not going to name it, because naming it would make this about that home. And it is not about that home. What I saw there, I believe I would find in some form in many of the places we operate in the name of the church. I saw people who had given their entire lives to the service of God and to the service of the poor. I saw them waiting for meals, waiting for warmth, waiting for someone to sit with them and ask how they were, not as a duty but as a human being asking another human being. He looked at the camera. I sat with a woman who wrote me a letter because she was afraid the truth would die with her if she did not. I sat with a priest who spent 30 years in Africa so that children he had never met could be baptized. He was sitting alone in a cold room. He asked me if I was the doctor. He stopped. He looked down. When he looked up, his eyes were full. He asked me if I was the doctor, he said again. And his voice had changed. It had become the voice of a man who is no longer speaking publicly but cannot stop himself from speaking the truth. And I thought, this man is 91 years old. He has given everything. And the church, our church, cannot keep his room warm. He pressed his fingers briefly to his mouth. His shoulders tightened and released. When he continued, his voice was steady again, the steadiness of someone who has passed through the feeling rather than suppressed it. The church does not exist to maintain itself. It exists to love. And love, real love, the kind that costs something, does not file a report and call it care. Love shows up. Love sits down. Love asks how you are sleeping, and whether you are warm, and whether you are afraid. Our elderly are not burdens to be managed. They are the memory of the church. They are the ones who carried us. And when we fail to carry them in return, we have failed at the most basic thing we were asked to do. He leaned forward slightly. I am asking every diocese, every religious congregation, every Catholic institution that operates a care facility. Look this week at those places. Not at the reports, at the places. Walk the corridors. Sit with the residents. Ask the nurses how many of them are covering how many people. Find out when the heating was last repaired. Find out when the last Mass was celebrated. And if the answers make you uncomfortable, stay uncomfortable. Do not file the discomfort away. Let it change something. he ended simply. To every elderly priest, every elderly sister, every person who gave their life to this church and is now living in one of these houses, I see you. Not as a category, not as a line in a budget. I see you, and I ask your forgiveness for every moment the church made you feel invisible. Aftermath. By the morning of March 3rd, the statement had been viewed more than 4 million times. Headlines in Italian, Spanish, Portuguese, English, French, German, Polish, Tagalog. A columnist in a Rome newspaper, not a Catholic publication, wrote that she had not expected to be moved by a papal address and that she had been wrong. A journalist in Chicago wrote simply, "He means it." Cardinal Bortoni's office confirmed a maintenance crew had been sent to Casa Sant'Angelo on the morning of March 2nd. The heating in the East Wing was restored by mid-afternoon. Additional staff had been assigned. The budget revision was underway. Sister Josefina watched the 16 minutes in silence on a tablet Elena brought to the common room. When it was over, she sat for a long time with her hands folded on the table. He kept the important part. He didn't change it. Elena asked what she meant. The part about Father Lorenzo. He didn't change it to something easier. He kept it exactly as it was. A pause. That is how you know someone means what they say. Closing, Father Lorenzo, when told that the Pope had visited him and spoken about him in a statement seen by millions, listened carefully. He asked a few questions. He seemed satisfied with the answers. Then he said, with the unhurried serenity of a man whose sense of what matters had been refined by 91 years of paying close attention, "I thought he was the doctor, but he was kind. A kind man is good company, doctor or not." He picked up his rosary. Outside his window, the Rome sky was beginning to lighten toward the particular pale gold of a March afternoon, the kind that promises, without quite delivering, the warmth of spring. The heating was working. Dinner that evening arrived hot. It was a small thing. It was also everything.